GB News has been fined £100,000 for broadcasting a one-hour show where members of the audience had the opportunity to ask the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak questions. The fine's been levied by Ofcom, which is the UK's communications regulator. If you're a TV or radio broadcaster, you need to comply with their rules, particularly in respect of news, political discussions, and so on. More about that in a moment. As an individual YouTuber, I do not have to comply with these rules, and I'm pleased that I don't, again, for reasons which will become clear in this video. And I understand that GB News is challenging the underlying decision by way of judicial review and that Ofcom is defending it. I will link the relevant documents in the description below. I encourage you to read them in for yourself and don't just rely on my video to form your views. But my initial reaction to this is that it seems to me to be a bit of an attack upon free speech and a little bit ridiculous. And I'll explain why I say that in this video. But first of all, let's look at the rules that they say have been breached at the outset. Ofcom says that GB News was in breach of the broadcasting code under rules 511 and 512. Now, I've talked about these previously on this channel before, and they read as follows. In addition to the rules above, due impartiality must be preserved on matters of major political and industrial controversy and major matters relating to current public policy by the person providing a service in each programme or in clearly linked and timely programmes. That wording there will become very important in due course. Rule 512, in dealing with matters of major political and industrial controversy. Major matters relating to public policy and appropriately wide range of significant views must be included and given due weight in each programme or in clearly linked and timely programmes. Views and facts must not be misrepresented. They say that they are in breach of these rules and imposed a sanction of £100,000. Now, there's a few reasons why I think you might not really fully agree with this. Now, the programme complained of is still available on YouTube. I will also link this in the description below. And this was aired on the 12th of February this year. So this was before the election was called, but obviously within the election year. Now, just to give you an idea of what this programme was and the series of programmes was intended to be and Ofcom's problem with it following complaints it received, GB News intended, and in the case of Rishi Sunak did, invite senior politicians onto a show where it had randomly selected members of the audience who were undecided in their vote to pose questions to the politician. They were unrehearsed, unscripted, so in essence the members of the audience could ask whatever they liked and the politician would have the opportunity to respond for an hour. Now obviously this is different from a debate because if you invited opponents onto a show, then they have a debate and they respond to the same questions and they give their own answers and then it's completely balanced. Both sides of the equation are then represented in the same show. This show was different. This show was intended by GB News to have a full hour of people who may not have been decided about whom they were going to vote for and ask these questions of the senior party. In this case, in this show that aired, Rishi Sunak. Ofcom's problem with that, in essence, was that this was a one-sided show and that the views were largely unchallenged within that show, even though the members of the audience had the opportunity to challenge those views. There's a lengthy discussion about what was said and what was discussed within that in itself, which is quite lengthy within these documents. So if you do have the time, go and read them for yourself. But in essence, Ofcom's problem was that that show was somewhat one-sided. Now, GB News' broad response to that was that there was a planned series of shows which would have made the whole series much more balanced. And case in point, GB News was in discussion with senior members of the Labour Party to have Keir Starmer come on a separate show, do a similar one-hour question time with members of the audience, and that would have been a perfectly balanced show in a linked and timely programme, which is where this wording comes back. So Ofcom says that you have to preserve due impartiality. So a company doing the broadcast must show both sides of the argument, which is essentially what I try to do on my channel. I don't always succeed, and neither do I have to succeed in that because I am not regulated by Ofcom. But in the case of GB News, they should be duly impartial, either within the programme itself, Now, it doesn't have to be completely balanced. It just has to be balanced in a way that it does at least invite the opposite view. There's a few more rules around that, but let's not get into that. Or in clearly linked and timely programs. Now, this was described as being the first in a series. In fact, I recall in his opening, Rishi Sunak said this was the first of its kind event. So it was the first in a series of what seems to be clearly linked programs. But the interesting bit for me is the timeline itself, because this is what leads me to believe that this is a bit of a ridiculous conclusion, with all respect to Ofcom. But let's take a look at the timeline here. On the 7th of December, Mr. Booker and Mr. Hope both said that they met with Sir Keir Starmer's senior advisory team, led by Matthew Doyle, over dinner. Mr. Booker said that this was to discuss the ongoing working relationship between the party and the channel, GB News. One of the main topics for discussion was the proposed People's Forum series. So this was a discussion between GB News and the Labour Party in December 2023, including how it would work and that GB News wished Sir Keir Starmer to participate. Mr. Booker also said that they left dinner with the impression that there was a serious interest on Labour's side in participating. On the 15th of December, another meeting was held between GB News and the Labour Party representatives. Mr. Booker said that the topic was discussed again during a presentation at the GB News offices, and GB News were again under the impression that Sir Keir Starmer would participate. Mr. Booker said that it was only after this meeting that GB News felt sufficiently encouraged by Labour's stance and their positive response to then approach the Conservative Party to request the Prime Minister's participation. Now, that bears a little explanation here, because any news company approach, let's say if I wanted to interview both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, they, I suspect, wouldn't be interested in coming on my channel and discussing these things. So when a company is trying to get someone to come on to interview, even with a stature as GB News or anyone else, if they want to have both sides, they're obviously going to approach both sides and decide in which order they do it, and the least likely of the two is, I suspect, going to be the Prime Minister, whoever the Prime Minister is at that time. So it would make sense that they approach the Leader of the Opposition first, and if they seem to get an agreement, then they'll approach the Prime Minister's office and say, we're going to have you both on, just so that that is clear in my understanding here. So they were then going to approach the Prime Minister's office. So the 15th of December, they then felt sufficiently encouraged by Labour's stance and their positive response to then approach the Conservative Party and request the Prime Minister's participation. Mr. Booker said that following the initial discussions with the Conservative Party, matters moved quite swiftly, leading up to the Prime Minister's inclusion in the 12th of February broadcast, and that he personally kept Matthew Doyle up to date during the process. 7th of February, Mr. Hope said that he spoke to another, so this again is before the broadcast. On the 7th of February, Mr. Hope said that he spoke to another Labour Party spokesman who Mr. Hope said responded positively to my suggestion that Sir Keir take part. Mr. Hope added that he also sent text messages to the spokesperson on the 7th and the 12th of February asking if it could be announced that Sir Keir would appear in the next People's Forum. Mr. Hope said that the spokesperson replied that they would wanted to see the broadcast featuring Rishi Sunak first. So this then puts them in a bit of a conundrum. Do they air the programme and wait? So this then, whilst not a full commitment, we want to see this one first before committing to coming on. One would assume, I would think, that if you have the Prime Minister on, that the opposition would want to come on and have their say. I suspect, but that's my view. Let me know your view in the comments below. If you were the opposition, would you want to go on the programme and have your say as well? That would be my definition of due impartiality and the parties taking part. The 13th of February, so this is the day after the broadcast, which was on the 12th of February. 13th of February, Mr. Hope said that he contacted the Labour Party spokesperson the day following the broadcast on the programme and told us that the spokesperson said there was a lot on at the moment in the party. Let's speak again next week. So no commitment either way. The 19th of February, this is 5 days after the programme and before Ofcom announced its investigation. Mr. Booker said that he requested a catch-up with Mr. Doyle to discuss Sir Keir Starmer appearing in the future programme. Mr. Hope also contacted a Labour Party spokesperson on the same date and was told prior to the announcement of the Ofcom investigation that the Labour Party was still considering GB News' request. Mr. Booker said that Mr. Doyle responded later that day and informed me that in light of developments, i.e. the Ofcom investigation, which had just been announced, Sir Keir's participation had been placed on hold. Mr. Hope's contact then told him later that day that there had been an agreement to pause pending the Ofcom process. So, in summary, discussion with Labour seemed that they want to go ahead. Then they approached the Prime Minister's office, and they seemed to move quickly with their participation. Labour still a little bit non-committal, wanted to see the programme first. The programme was aired. I think there's a reasonable assumption that the opposing party was at least given the opportunity to respond, given an opportunity to appear, and I would think would want to appear, given that this was an election year. If the Prime Minister was going on the show, the then Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was going on a show to answer questions for an hour, Leader of the Opposition might well take up that opportunity to go on the show and have his hour answering said questions. Then the show was aired. They were still non-committal. Then the Ofcom announced an investigation. Then Labour pulled out. But the problem I have with that is this. Ofcom then decided that GB News was in breach because they did not comply with the due impartiality rules by including either an appropriately wide range of significant views or giving due weight to each of them in the programme or in clearly linked programmes. But if Labour pulled out because Ofcom launched an investigation, how could that possibly then result in a clearly linked and timely programme to include those opposite views, because Labour got cold feet, essentially. They essentially decided not to take part because of Ofcom's investigation. So then Ofcom made the decision that GB News was in breach of Rules 5, 11 and 12 and said, given the circumstances of the case, Ofcom considers that this breach is serious. Given the licensee's compliance history repeated, we'll therefore consider this breach for the imposition of a statutory sanction. This is the initial view of the breach decision maker. It will be reconsidered by the sanction panel. And then ultimately culminating in Ofcom's decision to impose a financial penalty of £100,000, which again, I stress, I understand is being challenged by GB News as by way of judicial review, which is a judge's review of a public body decision of public law, which I also understand Ofcom is defending. Now, my problem with this decision is twofold, really. Firstly, it seems a bit ridiculous to hold GB News responsible when Labour pulled out because of Ofcom's launching an investigation into the programme, and thus it just wasn't possible for them to hold the second programme to have the due impartiality to reflect Labour's views. But also, it's Ofcom's responsibility, duty in fact, to uphold the freedom of expression whilst applying these rules to broadcasters, and Ofcom admits as much in its own decision. It says Ofcom must perform its duties in accordance with the right to the freedom of expression set out in Article 10 ECHR. Freedom of expression is one of the essential foundations of a democratic society. As is well established, Ofcom says, it encompasses the broadcaster's right to freedom of expression as well as the audience's right to receive information and ideas without interference. And so essentially what they are doing here is fining to the tune of £100,000 GB News for airing a programme which admittedly had one-sided views, but ostensibly had the plan to follow up programmes with Labour providing the opposite views, I presume the opposite views by Labour, in what would clearly be a linked series of programs. Now, obviously, Ofcom goes through, and I'll link these documents below, but Ofcom goes through an explanation as to why it didn't accept all of that. I'm just expressing a bit of a view here that I think this does fly in the face of the freedom of expression, which we all enjoy. Now, in its decision, Ofcom did say that they took into account in fact, there's a lot of detail as to what was discussed on that program and the setup of GB News and what it's there for and so on. Ofcom also goes through quite clearly why it rejected the argument of clearly and timely linked programs and so on, essentially saying there should be a more specific link between them. But even then, Ofcom also says that the code does not define clearly and timely linked programs. So for a broadcaster to try to juggle everything and get everybody on separate programs when they appear on the face of these documents and the timeline to have had such an agreement, at least in principle, in place, that does leave it open to question, and that is obviously down to the judge in this case. Now, again, I'll reiterate, nothing that I say in this video is either intended nor likely to have any impact on this court case whatsoever. Everything I'm saying is being rehearsed and argued within these documents, and of course each party will have their own legal representatives, etc. But ultimately, with Ofcom saying that in this case GB News had not obtained a confirmed agreement from the leader of the opposing party to contribute to a future programme, and thus they were not sufficiently linked. I'm not sure that really warrants a £100,000 sanction, which in the sense of it flies in the face of the freedom of expression. But you may disagree with that, and that is entirely the point. We are supposed to be able to and entitled to disagree with things and make comments about things and set things up in a way that should be fair. But to sum this up as to why I think this is a bit ridiculous, suffice to say, Ofcom has fined GB News £100,000 for hosting a 1-hour show where members of the audience could ask questions to Rishi Sunak. They had invited and intended to have Keir Starmer, then leader of the opposition, on a similar show, who didn't take part after Ofcom announced its investigation, and thus they said it was on hold. But in conclusion, because there wasn't a follow-up programme, Ofcom have fined GB News. I just think that's a bit ridiculous, but that's just my view, of course, and I am free to express that view. But either way, make of that what you will. Leave me your thoughts and comments in the box below. Please do subscribe to my channel here. I am independent. I have no editorial control. I don't have the Ofcom rules. I can give you my opinions sometimes. I usually don't, but if I do make them clear and so on. But I hope to give you both sides of the argument here. So Ofcom have given their reasons, and GB News are fighting it, and ultimately it will be for the judge to decide. But either way, I hope you found that useful. Please do like the video and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.